There is a specific moment when a person with strong narcissistic traits realizes that the dynamic they once controlled has changed. It is rarely a dramatic scene. It is not always marked by anger, confrontation, or some obvious display of emotion. Sometimes it arrives through something much quieter, a shift in energy, a change in access, a realization that the person they once influenced no longer responds the same way. For a long time, the relationship may have revolved around a certain pattern. One person gives attention, reassurance, emotional availability, forgiveness, and endless chances. They become the person who constantly tries to understand, communicate, repair, and hold everything together. They remember the details, notice the changes in mood, offer comfort during difficult moments, and continue showing compassion even when they themselves feel unseen. Slowly, they may begin carrying the emotional weight of the entire connection. They become the one who starts the conversations, fixes the misunderstandings, explains their feelings, and searches for solutions whenever something feels broken. Their love becomes an act of constant effort, while the other person becomes comfortable receiving without equally participating. At first, this pattern can feel like devotion. They may believe that patience will eventually create safety, that enough understanding will inspire change, or that showing someone unconditional love will teach them how to love in return. They focus on the person's potential rather than their present behavior. They hold on to the moments of kindness, the rare displays of affection, and the promises of what the relationship could become. But over time, something begins to shift. The person who keeps giving may start feeling emotionally exhausted. They notice that they are always waiting, always hoping, always trying to reach someone who seems just out of emotional distance. They begin questioning why love feels like a responsibility instead of a shared experience. The imbalance becomes clearer. One person is constantly proving their commitment, while the other person is simply accepting the proof. This dynamic can create a cycle where the giver feels responsible for maintaining the connection, while the receiver becomes accustomed to the attention and emotional support being available whenever they need it. The relationship begins depending on one person's ability to tolerate disappointment rather than both people's willingness to create something healthy. The hardest part is that the person giving the most often does it from a place of love. They are not trying to control the situation. They are trying to save something they believe is meaningful. They see the pain behind the other person's behavior and want to be the person who finally makes them feel understood. But love cannot be built by one person continuously reaching while the other remains emotionally unavailable. A connection requires two people choosing each other, not one person endlessly proving they are worth choosing. Eventually, the person who has been giving everything begins to recognize that their own needs matter too. They realize that forgiveness without accountability becomes a doorway for repeated hurt, and understanding without boundaries can slowly become self-abandonment. That realization is often where the deepest transformation begins. They stop asking, how can I make this person love me the way I need? And start asking, why have I accepted a relationship where I constantly have to earn basic emotional care? And that question changes everything. The other person becomes accustomed to receiving that emotional energy without truly recognizing its value. Over time, a pattern develops where one person feels responsible for maintaining the connection, while the other expects the connection to remain available no matter how they behave. Then, something changes. The messages become less frequent. The explanations stop. The emotional reactions disappear. The person who once argued, pleaded, or tried desperately to be understood becomes calm. They no longer feel the need to prove their worth, defend their intentions, or convince someone to care. And that silence can become the loudest message of all. For someone who relied heavily on attention, admiration, validation, or emotional reactions from another person, this change can feel confusing. The familiar pattern has disappeared. The responses they expected are no longer there. The emotional door they believed would always remain open suddenly appears closed. This is where many people describe a feeling of losing control. Not because another person was truly an object to control, but because the old emotional dynamic no longer works. The strategies that once created a reaction are no longer producing the same outcome. The cycle has been interrupted. The person who used to explain themselves for hours now chooses peace. The person who once felt desperate for answers begins accepting uncertainty. The person who once looked outside themselves for validation begins finding it within. And that transformation can be deeply unsettling for someone who was comfortable with the previous dynamic. A relationship built around unhealthy patterns often depends on predictability. If one person knows exactly what will make the other person respond, apologize, chase, or seek approval, they become familiar with that emotional rhythm. When that rhythm changes, the entire structure begins to collapse. This is why personal growth can be so powerful. Healing does not always announce itself. It often happens quietly. It begins when someone starts asking different questions. Instead of asking, how do I make them understand my value? They begin asking, why did I accept being treated this way? Instead of asking, how do I get their attention back? They begin asking, why did I lose myself trying to keep someone else close? This is one of the most powerful shifts that can happen after an emotionally exhausting relationship. For a long time, their focus may have been completely directed outward. They studied the other person's moods, searched for hidden meanings behind their words, analyzed every change in behavior, and tried to find the perfect way to reconnect. Their thoughts became centered around understanding someone else while their own emotions quietly moved into the background. They may have spent countless moments wondering what they could do differently. Maybe if they were more patient, more understanding, more available, or less emotional, things would finally change. Maybe if they explained themselves better, loved harder, or gave more chances, the other person would finally recognize their value, but eventually a deeper realization begins to emerge. The problem was never that they did not give enough. The problem was that they were slowly disappearing while trying to keep the connection alive. They begin noticing the small parts of themselves they had ignored. The hobbies they stopped enjoying, the friendships they neglected, the dreams they placed on hold, and the peace they sacrificed while constantly trying to maintain someone else's comfort. They realized that somewhere along the way, their life became focused on managing another person's emotions instead of honoring their own. This awareness can be painful because it requires facing an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the person they were fighting so hard not to lose was causing them to lose themselves, and that realization creates a different kind of strength. Instead of chasing explanations, they begin seeking clarity. Instead of begging for reassurance, they begin creating their own sense of security. Instead of measuring their worth by someone else's attention, they begin understanding that their value existed before that person entered their life. They stop seeing distance as something they must immediately fix. They stop treating silence as a problem they must solve. They stop believing that another person's withdrawal means they are not enough. Their perspective begins to change. They realize love should not require constant anxiety. Connection should not feel like a test they are always trying to pass. A healthy relationship should not make someone abandon their own identity just to feel chosen. Instead of focusing on changing another person, they begin rebuilding their relationship with themselves. They start listening to their own needs again. They learn to trust their instincts. They create boundaries that protect their emotional well-being. They begin giving themselves the patience, compassion, and understanding they were constantly offering to someone else. This is often the turning point. Not when the other person changes, not when the other person finally understands, not when the apology arrives. The true turning point happens when they realize they no longer need someone else's recognition to validate their own existence. The energy that was once spent chasing, convincing, and waiting begins returning home. They become more grounded. Their decisions come from self-respect rather than fear of losing someone. They no longer ask, what can I do to make them stay? They begin asking, does this connection allow me to be the person I truly am? This shift transforms everything. Because when someone reconnects with themselves, they no longer approach love from emptiness. They approach it from wholeness. They are no longer searching for someone to complete them. They are choosing someone who can walk beside them. And that is the moment when love stops being about holding on to someone at any cost and becomes about choosing relationships that honor both people. The person who once feared being abandoned begins discovering something more important. They can return to themselves. And once they have that, no distance, rejection, or loss has the power to take away who they have become. Because the greatest shift is not when someone walks away physically. The greatest shift is when they stop emotionally abandoning themselves. Many people who have experienced difficult relationships describe a moment where they realize they are no longer reacting from the same place. Things that once triggered anxiety no longer have the same power. Words that once caused them to question their worth no longer define them. The attachment may still exist. The memories may still exist. The love they felt may still have been real. But something inside them has changed. They begin to see the relationship with clearer eyes. They recognize that love without respect becomes painful. Connection without emotional safety becomes exhausting. Chemistry without consistency becomes confusing. And this realization can be incredibly freeing. When someone stops chasing validation, they become less vulnerable to emotional manipulation. When they stop trying to convince someone to choose them, they begin choosing themselves. When they stop measuring their worth through another person's attention, they reclaim a part of themselves they may have lost. For someone who was accustomed to receiving constant emotional engagement, this new version of the person can feel unfamiliar. The person they knew was always available. The person they knew always responded. The person they knew always tried to fix things. But now there is a different energy. There is calmness. There is emotional independence. There is a sense of self that does not disappear just because someone else withdraws affection. And that can create a powerful realization the old dynamic is gone. The person is no longer standing in the same emotional position they once occupied. However, it is important to understand that people respond differently when they feel they are losing influence in a relationship. Some may attempt to reconnect, some may become defensive, some may ignore the situation completely, some may reflect and genuinely change. Human behavior is complex, and not every reaction comes from the same place. The important transformation is not what the other person does next. The important transformation is what happens within the person who has healed, because healing changes the entire foundation of a relationship. Before healing, someone may stay because they fear losing the person. After healing, they stay only if the relationship is healthy. Before healing, they may accept apologies without change. After healing, they look for consistency. Before healing, they may confuse intensity with love. After healing, they understand that peace is also a form of love. This is why losing access to someone who has healed can feel different from losing someone who is simply angry. Anger still creates a connection, arguments still create engagement, emotional reactions still keep the cycle alive, but emotional freedom creates something different. It creates distance without hatred. It creates boundaries without revenge. It creates acceptance without needing the other person to admit everything that happened. That is often the moment when the power dynamic completely changes. Not because one person defeated another, not because someone won, but because one person stopped participating in a pattern that was hurting them. The greatest victory after a painful relationship is not making someone regret losing you. It is reaching a place where your peace no longer depends on whether they regret it. Because when your healing depends on their reaction, they still hold a piece of your emotional world. But when your healing comes from understanding yourself, rebuilding your confidence, and honoring your own needs, you become free. You stop waiting for someone else to recognize your value. You recognize it yourself, and that is often the moment when everything changes. The person who once felt impossible to leave becomes someone you can release. The situation that once consumed your thoughts becomes a lesson. The pain that once felt endless becomes evidence of your growth. Sometimes people lose access to you not because you wanted to punish them, but because you finally learned how to protect yourself. And that is a transformation no one can take away from you. The person who once made you feel tiny, disposable, unseen, and unstable starts to circle you in ways they can't even explain to themselves. That circling, that obsessive pull they can't shake toward the version of you they can no longer touch, is what people casually refer to as becoming bound to you for life. Not literally, not physically, but psychologically, in the sense that their nervous system stays permanently wired to your absence. Before going further into how this actually plays out inside a narcissistic mind, understand this first. A narcissist doesn't love you. A narcissist feeds on you. The gap between those two things is the gap between being chosen and being harvested. You were never truly a partner in their eyes. You were a resource, a steady, dependable source of emotional fuel, keeping their fragile inner world from caving in. Their intense interest in you at the start wasn't because they recognized your soul. It was because they recognized your supply, your empathy, your patience in explaining yourself, your tendency to overextend, your calm in the middle of their chaos, your talent for turning turmoil into peace. All of it was currency to them, and they spent it recklessly, convinced it would never dry up. But something shifts in a person who has been used this way for too long. Something quiet, something almost sacred. A tiredness settles in that no amount of sleep can touch. A loneliness that only deepens in their presence. A confusion that no conversation with them can untangle. That exhaustion isn't a weakness. It's your nervous system finally speaking the truth you've been too loyal to hear. This person was never safe, and no amount of love you give them will ever fill the void they were born with. The turning point begins the moment you stop over-explaining yourself. The moment you stop chasing clarity from someone whose entire control depends on your confusion. The moment you stop reacting to the bait, the cold shoulder, the sudden charm, the manufactured drama, the triangulating, the rewritten history, the gaslighting that made you doubt your own memory. The instant you stop feeding the emotional cycle they built around your suffering, something remarkable happens. You become impossible to read. And to a narcissist, an unreadable target is terrifying because their entire identity is built on other people's reactions. They don't have a solid sense of self. They have a performance, and every performance needs an audience. For years, you were their most dependable audience. You applauded when they craved recognition. You cried when they needed control. You apologized when they needed to feel blameless. You stayed when they needed proof they were worth loving. The moment you stop playing that role, the whole stage crumbles, and they're left standing alone under the lights with no script, no response, no reflection, just the deafening silence of their own hollowness. This is where the so-called bondage starts. And again, understand this clearly. It's symbolic, it's mental, it's internal. No one becomes anyone's actual possession. What really happens is far more fascinating and far more lasting. The narcissist becomes fixated on the version of you they can no longer control. They're haunted by your composure, your distance, your refusal to fight, the new quiet in your voice that no longer carries fear. They start watching you from afar. They ask people you both know about your life. They show up in places they suspect you'll be. They send messages that look casual but are calculated tests to see if there's still an opening. And even when, especially when you don't respond, the fixation grows stronger because nothing rattles a narcissist more than a former supply source who has found self-worth. You become the puzzle they never solved, the one person who didn't break, the one mirror that walked off still whole. That unresolved wound stays lodged in them in a way no new relationship, no fresh source of admiration, no new act can ever fully cover up. They'll move on outwardly, often faster than seems possible. But beneath that surface replacement lives a persistent, quiet awareness that you were the one who saw them completely and still chose to leave. That awareness becomes the invisible leash they'll carry for the rest of their life. Now, you need to understand why this actually works, because without grasping the mechanism, you'll be tempted to break it. You'll feel the pull to check in, to explain yourself one more time, to give one more chance, to answer one more text. Every time you give in to that pull, you reset the entire process. So pay close attention. Narcissists are hooked on emotional reaction. Your pain proves their significance. Your anger confirms their power. Your tears validate their importance. Even your hatred feeds them, because hatred still means you're occupying space in their mind. The only thing that truly starves them is genuine indifference, not performed, not loud, not the kind broadcast on social media, but the deep, settled, almost sacred indifference of someone who's finally realized this person isn't a mystery worth solving anymore, but a pattern worth letting go of. When you reach that level of internal quiet, you stop being a person to them and become a wound instead, a permanent psychological scar they can never fully heal. And that wound trails them into every future relationship, every future fight, every sleepless night when they can't figure out why rest won't come. The reason you were targeted in the first place isn't what you might assume. You weren't chosen because you were fragile. You were chosen because your strength took a very particular shape. You had a deep well of loyalty, of forgiveness, of the ability to see the wounded child hiding beneath someone else's cruelty. You could love a person through their ugliest moments and still hold on to belief in who they could become, and that trait, which in a healthy relationship would have been cherished, was exploited here instead. Now that you're stepping away, there's difficult work ahead. You have to stop condemning yourself for the very qualities that make you extraordinary. Your empathy was never the flaw. Empathy pointed at the wrong person was the flaw. Your love was never the problem. Love poured into something bottomless was the problem. And the work now isn't to shut down, to grow cold, to build walls so thick nothing can ever reach you again. The work is to become discerning, to keep your softness but guard the entryway, to keep your warmth but check who's earned it, to keep your capacity for deep connection while understanding that depth is something people have to earn, not something owed to anyone who demands it. It's earned through consistency, through accountability, through emotional safety, not through charisma, intensity, or the chaos of trauma bonding. Here's something almost no one says out loud. The longer you remain in your own peace, the more the narcissist unravels. Not because of anything you're doing to them, but because of everything you're no longer doing for them. You're no longer managing their emotions, no longer holding their identity together, no longer absorbing their projections, no longer softening their cruelty into something excusable. Without you quietly performing all of that invisible labor, they're forced to face themselves. And a narcissist confronting their own reflection without a buffer is one of the most agonizing psychological experiences a person can go through. That's why they'll do nearly anything to dodge it, including circling back to you, sometimes after years, with apologies that sound rehearsed because they are, insights that sound borrowed because they are, promises that sound desperate because they are. The real measure of your healing won't be whether you feel nothing when that moment arrives. It will be whether you can feel something and still hold your ground, whether you can recognize the history and still shut the door, whether you can wish them well from a distance while denying them any closeness up close. That calm, unwavering no is the exact moment you become free in a way they never will. To fully understand what you're walking away from, you have to understand how alone a narcissist truly is. Beneath the arrogance, beneath the contempt, beneath the icy stare and sharp words, is someone who has never once experienced real closeness. Not with you, not with anyone, not even with themselves. Because closeness demands the one thing they cannot survive, being seen without the mask on. Since they can't tolerate that, they destroy intimacy the moment it starts to form, which means every relationship they'll ever have after you, including whoever comes next, will just be another version of the same empty routine. Different person, same void, different setting, same script. And somewhere deep down, in a place they rarely let themselves visit, they know it. That knowing is the quiet torment they live with, and your absence becomes the loudest echo of that torment because you were the one who came closest to reaching them, the one who nearly cracked through the act, the one whose love was real enough to expose how hollow everything else has been. That's the real reason, on a deep psychological level, they never fully release you. Not because they love you the way you understand love, but because you've become a symbol of the life they might have had if they'd only been brave enough to be genuinely human. The final shift, the deepest one, happens when you stop needing them to understand. You stop craving the apology, you stop waiting for recognition, you stop wanting them to finally see what they did because you realize their understanding was never your path to freedom. Your own understanding was. The day you no longer need them to confirm your reality is the day their hold over you disappears completely. From then on, whatever they say, whatever they do, whatever performance they stage to pull you back in lands on a completely different person, someone who has rebuilt her nervous system from the ground up, someone who has learned that peace isn't dull, that calm isn't emptiness, that stability isn't the absence of love, but the presence of safety. And that person you're becoming right now is someone the narcissist will spend the rest of their life trying to understand and never quite manage to, because you will have done the one thing they were never capable of doing, choosing yourself, fully, quietly, permanently. That choice, repeated daily in 1,000 small ways, becomes the very chain that keeps them tethered to your memory forever, while you keep moving further into a life they can no longer reach. And somewhere, in a quiet, unplanned moment, in a room that suddenly feels too silent, in a stillness they can't fill with anything new, they'll think of you, and they won't understand why their chest tightens. They won't understand why nothing feels the same anymore. They won't understand why every mirror now reflects back the very thing they've spent their whole life avoiding. And you'll be somewhere else completely, breathing easier, loving differently, living differently. No longer waiting, no longer over-explaining, no longer translating yourself for someone who is never going to understand the language of your soul. And the further you go, the more they'll feel your absence. And the more they feel it, the harder they'll try to reach back. And the more they reach, the clearer it becomes that you were never the one who needed them. You were the one they could never survive losing. And somewhere in the quiet truth of that, a door opens inside you, one that's been locked since long before they ever showed up. On the other side of that door waits a version of you that has been patiently waiting, maybe for lifetimes, for you to finally stop bleeding for people who are never going to bandage the wound. And as you step toward her, as you feel her reaching back for you, you begin to understand everything you survived was only preparation for this exact moment.